How would the United States fare in a war on its own soil? It's a question that the US hasn't had to face during the era of modern warfare, with the few attacks taking place on American soil being isolated incidents. In some cases, those incidents, such as 9/11, triggered wars halfway across the planet, but the United States was never at risk of finding itself in a situation similar to the one Ukraine faces now. No invading force has entered the country for well over a century. The question we ask in this video is what would happen if the US did face an invasion? The result would likely be that the invading force would come up against an unbeatable defense that would eventually come out on top. To explain why, let's first look at the few times that the US has faced a war on its own soil, starting with perhaps the most famous conflict, the American Revolutionary War. You could argue that this war set the blueprint for how a country might fight against the United States, though that's only because it's the largest war fought on American soil. Still, the naval aspect of the war, with Britain sending troops over to the US via sea, is relevant, even if the US of the time didn't have the naval capacity to fight back against those ships. We also saw Britain cooperate with other nations in that war, with the American Battlefield Trust pointing out that the 22,000 soldiers Britain sent over were supported by 25,000 loyalists already in the United States, as well as around 30,000 German auxiliary troops, known as the Hessians, who were essentially mercenaries on the side of the British. But the US wasn't without allies of its own, with France playing a huge role in the war. It sent around 12,000 soldiers, as well as bolstering America's naval ranks with a substantial fleet as the war drew to a close. Those soldiers joined the 231,000 men, along with 145,000 who served in the colonial militias, to fend off the British. Even though this war happened centuries ago, it still gives us an idea of how an invading force of today might attack the United States. The attack, at least in part, would have to come by sea, and it's likely the attackers will be allied with other countries. However, Britain also had advantages that no invader of today would have, namely loyalists already in the United States to fortify positions on its behalf and a strong navy. In the modern US, an attacking country would start off with no foothold. It would have to invade and establish that foothold itself. On the American side, we also see allying with other nations taking place, a tactic that will prove important to modern America's defenses, as well as a sheer numbers advantage. Britain obviously lost that war. So even in the 18th century, the US was establishing itself as an unbeatable country on its own turf, even when it was still in its formative stages. The only other major war fought on American soil that involved an attacking force was the Mexican-American War. Kicked off by Mexican cavalry attacking a group of soldiers led by General Zachary Taylor in April 1846, the war officially began with a siege laid on Fort Texas. But thanks to being able to call in reinforcements and having superior equipment, Taylor repelled the Mexican invaders, with the US pushing them back into their own territory and eventually winning the war on Mexican soil. Still, this attack shows us a different approach an invader might take: encroachment on land via another country. It also shows us how the superior weapons and numbers America has once again helped it to defend its territory. You could argue that the Indian Wars that raged between 1776 and 1898 count as fighting on American soil, but in this case you could argue that the US was the main aggressor and that the Native Americans in the US weren't invaders, they were already there. Regardless, let's move on from this brief history lesson and into how an army of today would fight against the United States. It would have to take some cues from the British in the American Revolutionary War by attempting to secure a naval passage into the United States. Without that naval passage, the invading force won't be able to land any troops, restricting them to trying to invade via other countries. That likely won't be an option, as we'll demonstrate shortly. Should that invader manage to secure a foothold in the US, it would also need to establish aerial dominance so its ground troops have constant support as they make their way through the country. And of course, the invader would need to bring troops over in massive numbers to stand a chance against a country that has a population of around 340 million. None of that will happen. America's defenses are too strong in several ways, and that would help it repel an invading army, starting with one of the most important factors in global warfare: the size and strength of America's military. Every year, Global Firepower, or GFP, ranks the top 145 military countries in the world using something called its Power Index. That index grants each country a score based on its military strength, with a 0.0000 being considered a perfect military. The US has a score of 0.0699, with GFP ranking it number 1 out of 145 countries for sheer military might. And the numbers back that ranking. America has 1.328 million active military personnel, with 799,500 in reserve. Those aren't the largest numbers in the world. They place the US 3rd and 10th in sheer manpower, but they're certainly large enough to hunker down inside the US and defend it against an invader that can't move the same numbers into the country. The US also has the world's largest air force, with 13,209 aerial assets, including over 1,800 fighters, nearly 900 attack-type planes, and 950 fixed-wing transports, ensuring it's more than capable of maintaining aerial dominance over its own territory. The US also knows that any invader would have to navigate the massive oceans that border the country, which is why it's built one of the strongest navies in the world. It has 472 naval assets, the fourth most in the world, with the 75 destroyers in its fleet, ensuring that even navies that have more assets in total can't compete in terms of sheer power. That navy also has 11 aircraft carriers and 9 helicopter carriers, vital for transporting planes into the ocean so the US can run aerial attack operations on any invader. It all adds up to a numbers advantage, both in personnel and equipment, that no other country can truly match. There are bigger armies, there are even bigger navies, but in an invasion of the United States, the invading country has to deal with the logistical nightmare of bringing those numbers to bear on American soil, which won't be possible for reasons we'll go into later. However, there is one caveat to these numbers. Many of America's troops are stationed overseas. The United States maintains around 750 military bases in around 80 countries beyond the bases it runs at home. According to USA Facts, data acquired in September 2023, those bases host around 168,000 active duty troops, along with several thousand reservists. That could be a problem for the United States. If an invader did manage to bring huge numbers into the country, either alone or in alliance with another country, it may need to find a way to bring those troops back home. However, this massive overseas presence could also prove advantageous, as it could allow the United States to coordinate attacks on the invader's territory as it itself is being invaded. So the overseas troops issue is a double-edged sword. It means the US loses about a tenth of its manpower for fending off an invasion on its own soil, but it also means it has more attacking options overseas, with its many international bases also serving to solidify alliances that will feed into America's defense plan. But even with that caveat, an invader would face the prospect of fighting the world's strongest military on its own territory. That alone is likely enough to ward off most without considering the next aspect of America's defense plan. Its personnel are more battle-hardened than most. Never underestimate the value of experience in a war, with the US having experience in abundance. Its military has spent as much of the last century or so at war as it spent in peace. Starting at the turn of the 20th century, the US was engaged in World War I between 1917 and 18, followed by World War II between 1941 and 45. A 3-year war in Korea followed in 1950, with the US then moving on to fight the Vietnam War between 1964 and 1975. Operation Desert Storm came about 15 years later, with most of the first 2 decades of the 2000s being spent fighting the global war on terrorism. And that's without mentioning the many supporting roles the US has played, such as recently launching strikes on the Houthis in the Red Sea outside of its major wars. What does this mean for an invading force? The United States doesn't just have a large military with most of the world's best equipment, it's very capable of using that might to its advantage. The United States is a well-oiled machine militarily. So many of its people have direct combat experience or are learning from people who have experience. Granted, you could argue that the US hasn't been successful in several of its wars. It eventually left Vietnam and recently did the same in Afghanistan, but those were decisions made to preserve the military in wars that could have taken many more years, perhaps even decades, to resolve. When fighting on its own turf, the US wouldn't have the option of withdrawing. It also wouldn't want to escape or surrender either, meaning it will be bringing a military that's at full strength in terms of numbers and experience to bear. Compare that to a potential invader. Russia certainly matches the US in battle experience, though the Ukraine war suggests that it likely doesn't match it on the equipment quality front. And though China has undergone a vast military modernization over the past 2 decades, its forces are still relatively untested. The country's last war was the Sino-Vietnamese conflict of 1979, meaning its modernized forces aren't battle-tested. Invading the United States would be a baptism of fire, given that so many of America's soldiers will have recent experience from fighting the war on terror. So any country that wants to invade the US is at an immediate disadvantage militaristically. Then you throw geography into the mix. Earlier we talked about how the British were able to sail a limited number of soldiers into the United States during the Revolutionary War. That naval approach could be seen as a viable option for a modern invading force, but it's an option that's fraught with danger. To America's east lies the Atlantic Ocean. An invader attempting to cross from Europe has to navigate between 3,000 and 3,500 miles of frigid ocean before it stands a chance of alighting on US soil, and that's assuming passage from Lisbon in Portugal. Given that Portugal is friendly with the United States, any potential hostile European force, such as Russia, would have to sail much further if it uses the Atlantic to invade. Move over to the east and you have the Pacific Ocean, a 12,000-mile ocean that covers nearly half of the Earth's equator. The Pacific offers an even more difficult naval crossing option than the Atlantic. The distance is nearly insurmountable, with any invading force coming from Asia, such as China, also having to navigate past Japan and Australia. Both are allied with the United States via trilateral defense agreements, with both also hosting American military bases, meaning they could act as one of several early warning systems for the US. And all of that is before you take the Pacific Fleet into account. Consisting of around 200 ships, around 2/5 of America's Navy, and 1,500 aircraft, the Pacific Fleet is a dangerous force in its own right and is the culmination of America's 150-year presence in the ocean. It's staffed by 150,000 military and civilian personnel and would serve as a major barrier to any invading force from America's west. Even an attack from both sides, such as a coordinated naval assault by Russia and China, would run into challenges. The US has bigger and stronger ships and would be more than capable of defending itself in the Atlantic with a force equal to the Pacific Fleet. It would also be able to bring more aerial firepower into play, as it has more aircraft carriers than those two countries combined. The only real option for a naval invasion could come from the Bering Strait, a 51-mile-wide stretch of water that separates Russia's Cape Dezhnev from Cape Prince of Wales in Alaska. While that crossing would be much simpler than a Pacific or Atlantic crossing in terms of distance, as well as allowing any invader an easy route into Alaska, it's also such a small stretch of water that the US could easily defend it. America would basically bottleneck any naval force attempting to use the Bering Strait, buffeting ships with aerial attacks along with missile attacks from the 9 bases the US has in Alaska. Where does that leave a naval invader? It would have to somehow overcome the sheer strength of America's Navy to even secure passage into the United States, and should it manage to do that, likely lose hundreds of ships and thousands of personnel in the process. It would still have to deal with extremely long journeys just to get troops into the country. It would be a constant uphill battle, with the US having the ability to fortify on land and counterattack new troops as they arrive to create a war of attrition that would be devastating to an attacker. So, the invader might think, let's attack via land instead. Geographically, that is an option. The US isn't an island, as it's bordered by Canada to the north and Mexico to the south. Perhaps they could invade via those countries. If they tried, it wouldn't be without a fight. In fact, Canada would practically be a non-option. Not only is it a NATO member, meaning the US would come to its defense if it faced an attack on its territory, but Canada has long been an ally of the United States. The government of Canada even calls the United States its most important ally and defense partner, with the two countries having a long-standing military alliance that isn't going to be broken by an invader. Simply put, invading Canada to get to the United States is the same thing as invading the US directly. The invader is still going to face the same naval, aerial, and ground-based defenses. Only this time, they'd be stretched thinner and likely be forced to fight in the freezing cold temperatures of northern Canada to have a chance of getting to the border. It's simply not going to happen, as the invader would have to first take Canada before it could use it to secure an on-land route to the US from the north. But what about Mexico? There are some possibilities when going down this route. Mexico is a far smaller country than Canada in terms of sheer landmass, and it also isn't a NATO member. That means that the US isn't duty-bound by Article 5 of the NATO Charter, more on that later, to jump to Mexico's defense if it's invaded. An attacking force might even think that it could reopen the old wounds from the Mexican-American War to try and convince Mexico into allowing itself to be an entry point into the United States, but that isn't likely to happen. According to the Wilson Center, the United States and Mexico are now cooperating militaristically more than they have in years. That's thanks in large part to the Merida Initiative, which sees both countries working together to tackle the dual scourges of organized crime and drug trafficking across the border. Speaking of the border between Mexico and the United States, that isn't an easy crossing to make. Even if an invader were to secure Mexico, either via invasion or cooperation, the US has 20,000 border patrol agents and hundreds of barriers, walls, fences, outposts, and surveillance systems set up across that border. Granted, that doesn't constitute a full military defense, but it's still a barrier, one the United States could easily reinforce with aerial support, ground-based troops, and its navy. Add to that America having 15 active military bases in Texas, as well as more than 30 in California, and any invader that tries to encroach into the US from the south is going to have to fight through an extensive military presence to have a chance of getting further north. We talked about America's partners in the Pacific acting as an early warning system earlier. The border patrol near Mexico would be the same thing, as would Mexico and Canada themselves. Neither will see much benefit in hosting an invading force that wants to attack the US, meaning the US would know about the impending invasion and be able to prepare for it long before it actually happened. And these aren't America's only warning systems. There's also the Defense Support Program, or DSP. Operated by the United States Air Force Space Command Division, the DSP is a network of 23 satellites that the US uses to detect missile launches. Using infrared technology, those satellites are constantly scanning the globe for signs of launches that could impact the United States. While the focus is on nuclear launches, the DSP is also capable of picking up on smaller missile launches, such as those a country might use to buffet the US before attempting to launch a naval or ground invasion. And the DSP is far from the only satellite network the US has available. America constantly launches general reconnaissance satellites into orbit, with most being overseen by the National Reconnaissance Office, or NRO. According to the NRO, it uses satellites and other space-based capabilities to secure and expand America's intelligence advantage. That translates to, we can easily see troop movements in other countries and will know almost immediately if an invading force is trying to make its way to the United States. The US literally has an eye in the sky to go along with its many allies on the ground, all of which plays into its defense plans. No country is ever going to catch the US napping if it wants to launch an invasion. Now let's assume the invader overcomes all of these obstacles. They secure a route into the United States and get troops onto the ground. What happens then? America's land geography comes into play. Starting with a simple fact, the continental United States is enormous. It's roughly 3.8 million square miles, 277,000 square miles of which are water that an invader would have to be able to not only take but hold simultaneously to claim victory over the United States. It's an enormous landmass, offering American troops and even guerrilla fighters plenty of opportunities to regroup should an enemy manage to secure a victory in a major city. There are other issues. If the invaders come from America's west, they'll have to navigate the Rocky Mountains, stretching southward for 3,000 miles from Alberta, Canada, and into New Mexico. The mountain range is America's largest and stretches up to 300 miles wide in some locations. Technically, the Rocky Mountains are made up of around 100 separate mountain ranges, but the point is that they provide a clear landmass barrier that an attacker would have to overcome. There's no easy route through them, meaning an invader would have to either fly over, risking encounters with America's superior air force in the process, or allow itself to be forced through bottlenecks that make ground troops easy pickings for America's military. But at least the Rocky Mountains offer cover. Get past them and an invader reaches the Great Plains, taking up about 1.125 million square miles, about a third of America's total landmass. The Great Plains are flat land. Easy to navigate, terrible for an invading force that's trying to move massive amounts of troops through the United States. Not only would those forces face direct opposition on the ground, but they'd also be easy targets for bombing runs by American planes. And whether the force invades from the west or the south, it's going to have to navigate the Great Plains at some point. Move up to the north, and you also have the Great Lakes, practically sitting on the border between the US and Canada. They'll serve a similar purpose to the Rocky Mountains, not impossible to surmount, but likely forcing invading troops into bottlenecks that American forces could exploit. And given the strength of America's Navy, it could easily install patrol boats and even a few destroyers into those lakes to prevent enemies from crossing. Given that the lakes are landlocked, meaning there's no route into them via the Atlantic or Pacific Oceans, the invader wouldn't be able to combat America's Navy with its own. All of this points to a country that has natural fortifications already in place before you even consider the fact that every American state has at least one military base and multiple cities the invader would have to fight through. So maybe the attacker could take an alternative route. Rather than launching a full-scale invasion, perhaps it could try to starve the United States out. If we assume Russia and China combine to launch an attack, their combined naval forces are large enough to encircle the United States. While they may not have the power to defeat America's Navy, they could certainly wreak havoc on commercial vessels. That could be advantageous. The US imports about 15% of its food supply, as well as 8.51 million barrels of oil per day from 86 countries. Shut that down, and they could put a dent in American morale and production. But that won't happen either. America's food and energy imports aren't made out of necessity in the sense that it needs either to sustain itself. If the US were somehow cut off from its trade partners around the world, it would be able to self-sustain for an extended war effort. On the food front, the US exported $177 billion worth of food in 2021, 18% more than it exported the previous year. In an emergency, the US could simply halt these exports and focus its food production on supporting its own people. It wouldn't miss the 15% of food that it gets from overseas in any way other than on the variety front. So cutting that off would be more of an inconvenience to the US rather than a legitimate tactic for starving the country out. As for oil, in 2023, the US also exported 10.15 million barrels per day in the same year that it imported 8.33 million barrels per day. Again, stopping exports, which would be forced if an invader was somehow able to cause mass disruption to America's overseas supply lines, would mean that the US actually has even more oil than it does right now. After all, it exports more than it imports. Get rid of the imports and keep the exports, and the country gets an extra 1.19 million barrels per day. All of this assumes that the US would ever be cut off from its overseas suppliers in the first place. To manage that, an invading force would have to target commercial shipping vessels. And therein lies another problem. It would have to essentially attack other countries to do so. That brings us to the subject of America's allies. Earlier we touched on how the US has trilateral defense agreements in place with Japan and Australia. The other members of those trios are South Korea and the United Kingdom respectively. Both countries could offer early warnings for the US to prepare itself for invasion, as well as actively fight in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. But perhaps the most important alliance the US has comes from NATO. Under Article 5 of the NATO Charter, any attack on the soil of a NATO member is considered an attack on all NATO members. For a potential invader of the United States, that doesn't just mean taking on the already superior might of the US military. It'll also have to fight against 31 other member countries that are duty-bound to defend the US if it's attacked. Those countries include several that have powerful militaries of their own, including the previously mentioned United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Poland. In fact, the existence of NATO could make an invasion from America's east practically impossible. Most of Europe would fight on America's side in that scenario. Even if the invasion came from America's west, the US should be able to rely on its NATO allies to provide troops, equipment, and support. That shows us an interesting aspect of America's defense plan. An attack on the country would inevitably spark a world war, making it impossible for any invading force to take on the US alone. And even with all of that playing in America's favor, there's one more aspect we haven't covered yet: the US citizenry. Around a third of American citizens, 32%, say they personally own a gun, with 44% saying they live in a household that has at least one firearm. Worse yet for an invader, many of those everyday citizens claim they'll stay and fight for their country. Toward the end of 2022, The Spectator published an article covering a survey that showed that 41% of Democrats believe they'll stick around and fight in the event of a war on American soil. Republicans are apparently even more ardent defenders of their country. 68% say they'll stand their ground and fight. So an invading military wouldn't just have the full force of the US military to handle if it wanted to take the country. It would also have dozens of other nations to fight, thanks to NATO and Article 5 of its charter. The invader would also have to navigate either the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean, neither being an easy task, or defeat either Mexico or Canada first to secure an on-land route into the US. None of these options seem like a viable possibility. And even if by some miracle an invader actually managed to land in the US, it would face a self-sustaining country with geography that offers plenty of natural defenses against their forces. Throw in a large portion of the citizenry that claims it will be willing to stay and fight alongside the military, and you have overwhelming numbers to combat, alongside geographical disadvantages and the most modern military equipment in the world. And that's why America's defense plan is unbeatable. But what do you think? Is there any route around an invading force could take that would allow it to defeat the United States? Would an invasion even happen? Or would an enemy that's willing to declare war against the US instead rely on nuclear weapons to take it out? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out Russia's top nuke targets, or click this other video instead.